And this evening we've invited Ajahn Gavesako to offer the Dhamma reflection. Many of you will know him over the years. He began his monastic life in England. He's originally from Czech Republic, but began his monastic life, and he's been a bhikkhu for, I think it's 25 years. And so in monastic life for at least 27 years, and began at Amaravati Monastery in Hertfordshire, and spent many years on and off living here, and not so many years ago. And the last year, or maybe even a little bit more, he's been residing at Cittaviveka Monastery, our branch monastery outside of Rome, Italy, helping out there, and in particular because Ajahn Chantapalo the abbot is still on sabbatical for a few more weeks. And so Ajahn Gavesako joined us last weekend, arrived, and he's staying until the 18th of the month. So we're very happy to have him here again, and hence this invitation. So.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So it's nice to be back in this Dhamma hall, and in this during this month of May, here in Chithurst. Beautiful nature at the moment. The forest, the lake at its best. Yes, it's been about 4 years, since I last lived here, so it's nice to come back, walking around, reflecting on the history of a place like this, and the development of monasteries, and the generations of monastics that have lived here, that came through here, putting it in the larger and longer, much longer context of the Buddha Sasana as it's spread and developed from India, for the last 2,600 years. When we encounter the Buddhist teachings, we always come across it in a particular cultural context at a particular time, and it'll be a different experience, a unique experience every time for every person. It's not some kind of revealed religion like others, but this is a carefully formulated, carefully articulated teaching that's supposed to help us train our minds for liberation, leads to a development of wholesome qualities. So it's been very well formulated and put in words, put in texts, transmitted over millennia to us. So when one moves between monasteries in different countries, different continents, encounters the Dhamma teachings in different languages, it helps one to appreciate this, how important it is to pay attention to every word, every sentence, every way of the Dhamma, every way of formulating the Dhamma. Not take it for granted, that whatever we encounter, whichever way we speak about the Dhamma, we've got to be careful. We got to pay attention to it. It's something the Buddha himself actually encouraged, and it was one of the salient characteristics of the Dhamma teachings. He said that it's svakhato, is well explained, well expounded, with the right kinds of words and similes, and in various ways. So in this month in particular, we reflect on the Buddha's life, the birth, awakening, passing away, because it's the month of the Visakha Puja celebration. So it's good to take it up as an object of contemplation a little bit. How is it that we can encounter the Buddhist teachings and make them part of our life in this country at this time, this sort of historical era? It's not something easy to come by. They say, it's hard to be born as a human being. It's hard to listen to the true teaching, and then to practice it is even more rare. So we can consider ourselves fortunate in this situation. It's not been that easy for people in different countries, different eras before. It's a bit of a miracle that these teachings have survived. All the, if you look at the history, uncertain history of empires and different continents. Buddhism is a kind of historical phenomenon that the physical survival of the teachings and the Sangha has depended on what went on, of course, in history, and sometimes some big disaster can wipe out a whole civilization, a whole religion, lots of historical documents, but through some coincidences of history, we're still here, still practicing, so that the Buddhist teaching can spread all the way to Europe, to first here to England. Actually, this was one of the early adopters of Buddhism. Was here in England. Again, that was partly a matter of historical coincidence that as the British Empire expanded into Southeast Asia, particularly countries like Sri Lanka and Burma, India, where there was Buddhism, there was particularly the Theravada school still existed there, and there was this interest and curiosity to find out, where did these teachings come from historically, what's the origin of all this, learning the languages in which it was recorded and transmitted. So there was a lot of that kind of work done in, say, starting about 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And gradually the Western world became more aware of what the Buddhist teachings were about. So we got these Buddhist texts and teachings translated. And there was a gradual refinement and a better understanding of what was actually in those texts, what were they describing. There was a greater awareness of how this religion was actually practiced in Asia by the natives there. And then more and more Western people started to actually become really deeper involved with it, and even considering themselves to be following the Buddhist teachings, to be Buddhists, so even become ordained as monks. So that's really not that long ago. The first Western Buddhist monks were probably ordained about around the 1900, around that time. It's not just over 100 years ago. So if you consider it, how many generations of Westerners have had access to this way of life, to this way of training, we can consider ourselves fortunate. Now Buddhism has spread all over, especially Southeast Asia, from India, over the early centuries. It's quite a fascinating kind of history of Buddhism if you read something about it. Put it in the sort of context of the history of the world, history of civilizations, and the spread of various ideas, and it's also very closely connected, linked to language. Of course, in order to understand anything, we have to communicate. Communication happens through language on a human level. So the Buddhist teachings have been originally, the Buddha probably was able to understand a number of dialects. What we call Pali now is actually a slightly formalized dialect of the Magadan part of India, which must have been chosen at the first council as a kind of standard to sort of convert all the other teachings that were given in other dialects into that one, and then later was written down. So it became known as the Pali texts that we have, the Pali canon recorded in that particular dialect. But it probably was not the only one. So it's becoming more and more clear now that as the Buddhist teaching spread from that part of India south and west and north and different parts of India, then they would kind of convert it to their local dialects, and slowly the teachings went further and further from their origin geographically, and there was a need to translate the Dhamma teachings into all these other languages. So that in itself, took centuries, millennia, to spread, say, all the way to, say, Japan. Geographically, it's a long way off from Magadan in somewhere northern India. So it's quite an incredible journey, and of course the words, they don't travel somehow magically and unchanged. It's a whole kind of historical, cultural process, how the teachings get transmitted, passed from person to person, written down on palm leaves and paper later. And how do people understand these symbols that are written down? How do people read them? How do people pronounce letters, words, syllables? It's a very complex kind of cultural process, actually. So we cannot just assume that one word found in a Buddhist text somewhere, say in Japan, will mean the same thing, correspond exactly to some similar kind of word written down in India, say 1,000 years before that, or for that matter even today, in a book on Buddhism that you find in a bookshop here in England today. So every country, every people, every era has to find its own way of accessing and understanding the Buddhist teachings in its own context. And precisely how that happens, that it's a mysterious process, and that's what Buddhist scholars study and describe. We have interesting histories of how Buddhism developed, how Buddhism spread, You can read about all these things. So we have received our teachings here through the lineage of the Thai forest tradition. The history of this particular kind of lineage, Western monks, is not that old, just over 50 years. So we are in a unique situation ourselves. How do we understand the teachings? How do we apply them in our cultural context? How do we bring them here into this culture, other cultures around the Western world? And it keeps changing. If you notice the way, say we have Ajahn Chah's translated books and talks given in say Northeast Thai dialect, and you see some of the early translations that were made by the Western monks, who themselves had just a kind of basic grasp of the language. They were pretty rough and missed a number of subtleties, subtle points, and then they were further refined later, and then they were edited, re-edited, retranslated. So we keep actually still going back, even in this case, to trying to further refine our understanding of what was actually said, what do we understand by that. And then see the Ajahn Chah was speaking in a particular historical social context of his own, a culture that was like steeped in Buddhist teaching, Buddhism as a whole Buddhist culture for centuries. He had grown up surrounded probably by the stories and legends, and the whole culture basically was based around Buddhism. Whereas here, when we listen to him say something, describe something, using certain similes or references to names from the life of the Buddha or some Buddhist stories, we don't have that same background. We might have read something, a little bit, some history of Buddhism, but we receive it from our own cultural background, our own social background. It means something different to us. We can try to get as close as we can to like his point of view, his perspective, but often we might actually even misunderstand some of the things he says, because we don't have that same shared perspective. So the work of a translator is not an easy one. You have to work as someone who has to understand both worlds and both contexts pretty well. Otherwise you can make mistakes, you can make oversimplifications. You can even confuse the message, what was meant. So it's definitely not an easy task. A very refined kind of work, working with letters, syllables, words. Every letter matters. You can't drop anything. This was an issue even during the early transmission of the Buddhist teachings, as Buddhism went to north, towards China on the Silk Route, and that's where it entered a whole different linguistic, cultural context. Not the larger Indian context where there were many maybe shared ideas, shared language roots and connections, but suddenly it had to be translated into a completely different type of language, like Chinese, for example. Then there were quite big shifts of meaning, so many words had to be basically just compared to pre-existing ideas that already existed in that new other culture, say Chinese, just compared to something that they already knew, say from the Taoist teachings and so on. So there were quite big differences sometimes, shifts of meaning occurred, because you have to work with the language you've got. You can't invent a new language that easily. You can of course import new concepts, you can import new words, like we do. We take on like loan words, like we have even now in English. Quite a number of like Buddhist terms have become standardized, and we use them, but not always in the original meaning actually. Sometimes the meaning has shifted quite a lot and can lead to even misunderstandings of what was meant. So you need to carefully go back and sometimes trace the meaning of each word and look at the original context if you want to be sure that this is what the Buddha meant with it. There are some even accounts of this, some kind of humorous stories in Pali commentaries of how this can easily happen, because in say India at that time, there was no mass communication, radio, TV like today, so every region would have developed its own dialect, and as the Buddha say, wandered through the Ganges Valley, then going from, he wandered many hundreds of miles on foot, and then coming to different areas, they would be using, say, slightly different words for the same objects, and he was aware of it, so he probably adapted, his language to that. But sometimes there could be misunderstandings. So there's a verse in the Dhammapada that starts with Yocha vasasatang jive apasang udayabayang. Whoever would live for 100 years without seeing the rise and fall of things. So the verse starts like that, and it's an encouragement to develop the perception of impermanence, to see the rise and fall, udaya vaya, meaning the arising and the passing away of phenomena, and this is contrasted with someone who doesn't see this. So even one day of seeing the rise and fall of things is better than 100 years of not seeing this impermanence, inconstancy of phenomena. So if you recite this in Pali, there's this word udaya bayang, udaya and vaya, rise and fall, arising and ceasing. But in the commentary it says that some monk misheard the teaching, and maybe he didn't quite get the misunderstood maybe the dialect, or the way certain consonants get doubled in Pali and duplicated. So he understood it differently, he heard it differently, and was repeating the verse as instead of udaya bayang, he said udaka bakang, which means something like if one was to live for 100 years without ever seeing a water heron. So a water heron, I just walking through the forest here, we have a water heron, I think, on our lake. So imagine going there to meditate and thinking, what the Buddha said, we should be trying to watch the water heron. Maybe there's something deep about this. Maybe when I see the water heron catch the fish, or the way it flies or something, there's something deep in it, and I can get enlightened by watching the heron. So the commentary said, that's was a mistake. The monk got corrected and said no. But it points out that even at that time, through incorrect or careless transmission of the teachings, some misunderstandings could occur, some mistakes could happen, and you have to remember that all the teachings basically were transmitted in this oral way by just memorizing and reciting it back. Like the teacher's duty was to train his disciples in this recitation, and the chanting, like we did tonight, was not just for like puja or inspiration, but it was actually the way to transmit the teachings. And monks would have spent a long time reciting and passing it on. So there was great attention was paid to the detail and correct pronunciation and understanding the meaning and questioning the students about the meaning. And a lot of Buddhist teachings is also in the form of poetry, like this Dhammapada collection and other collections, because they are easy to memorize. They are in a verse form. So, and then these teachings got really translated into all kinds of languages, dialects. But it seems that over time, as the centuries passed, and all kinds of new teachings were also added, because it's a process that is being kind of studied and uncovered. Why there's like an older layer of the early teachings, and in some schools then they sort of closed the canon at that point and didn't add any new teachings, but others kept kind of adding newly developed ideas and teachings, and there was layers upon layers until many centuries after. So we are more in the kind of conservative camp of the Theravada school, that there's a kind of a clear sense of what was early, and then there were later like commentaries and sub-commentaries and so on developed as well with kind of new ideas, but it was clear that this was not like the Buddha's teachings. These were more like interpretations. So there's a whole very rich culture of based around Buddhism. There are also the kind of like lots of stories, and there's the Jataka stories about the previous lives of the Buddha, and other stories that helped in a kind of more simplified form to transmit the kind of basic moral teachings to the kind of local population of people who couldn't read and write, but they would understand metaphors, similes, simple stories with animals and so on. So there's a very rich culture. And when you go to Asia, some of these countries in Southeast Asia, you see lots of like temple paintings, mural paintings, which illustrating all these various stories, and that was the kind of Buddhism that the most of the local people would have known. The kind of very deep philosophical teachings of Buddhism were probably limited to monks who could actually read Pali, study Pali, and they were able to read the palm leaves and explain them to others. So these days it's much easier. Anybody can open a book. They are widely available, or search on the internet, and you can go straight to the kind of deepest philosophical teachings of Buddhism without any need to depend on any kind of interpreter. Just do it yourself if you have the right kind of language knowledge. But that's not how it was for most of Buddhism's history. For most of history, probably even most monasteries wouldn't have had access to all the teachings of the Buddha. They probably didn't possess like a complete library of the Pali, Tipitaka, the palm leaves, because they are very difficult to create, to make. In order to write, a single sutta or a book collection of suttas probably would have taken many hundreds of hours of kind of scratching the symbols on palm leaves and preserving them carefully. And he had to be supported by someone, like the kings usually supported this kind of project, creating and transmitting a whole Tipitaka scripture. So it wasn't an easy task to keep the Buddha Sasana alive in that way, but there was always enough of the teachings, enough of the texts. There was understood and on various levels, and there were like the experts, some of the monastics that really specialized in this, and they preserved the teaching in such a pure way that they could be understood by the future generations, later generations as well. So we haven't really lost very much. We can consider ourselves fortunate in that. So some people like to approach, Buddhism from this perspective as well. These days, even don't have to even be a monk or nun to study Buddhism at this level. There are academic scholars, experts that can study things, write things in great depth, explain things in great detail. So we have probably the best ever access to this kind of wide variety of Buddhist teachings in many languages than ever before. So we can. It's quite fascinating if you are a bit into languages and have some sensitivity to this. And then we can also, practice in terms of the practice of the teachings. We know how to formulate things carefully. When we've applied the Dhamma, when we've learned it, when we've practiced with it, and then explaining it to others is the other aspect, and we'll take care and we'll have the kind of respect for the form of the teachings. So we have certain like ritual, behavior and towards Buddha statues and stupas and so on. In fact, stupas for a lot of Buddhist history, they were also used as a kind of places to keep either sacred relics of the Buddha or other teachers passed away, or they used to put quotes or whole kind of suttas or sutras inside the stupa as a way of preserving it for future generations. So the belief was that you can kind of extend the life of the Buddha Sasana by putting some of these kind of sacred objects into stupas. So, like we have done here actually. It's a symbolic kind of act these days, but it can uncover some very ancient stupas, and they'll have like a golden or metal plate with something scratched in it, and we can read it if we know the alphabet, the script. Usually what it says is ye Dhamma hetupabhava, meaning those things that arise from causes and conditions, and then the Buddha has taught the source of all these things and their cessation. That was used as an early expression of the kind of the characteristics of the Buddha Dhamma. That was basically the teaching of conditionality, dependent origination, which set it apart from most of the other religions, teachings that were around in Asia at that time. So this is one of the unique Buddhist teachings that we can still learn, study today, about conditionality, dependent origination, pointing out not just that yes, things depend on one another, but the specifics of how things depend, or how this phenomenon, this condition is caused by another one. And if we want to achieve a particular goal, like the cultivation of wholesome states, then we need to follow like a specific path of practice and understand what condition lead to other conditions. So that was the very unique way of the Buddhist teachings, how he explained his teaching, many suttas, many of these kind of metaphors where he explains, how if you cultivate this sort of virtue or this kind of practice, then it leads to something higher, and then based on that you can build your practice even higher, and so on and so forth until you reach the goal. So that is the specific style of teaching in Buddhism that set it apart from many other teachings. It was known for many centuries. It was actually not known as Theravada. It's a fairly recent term, but sometimes it was known as the Vibhajavada, meaning the teaching of analysis, or kind of analytical teaching. So the Buddha wasn't giving like some kind of simple answer or just believe this and you'll be saved or something, but he was one who makes distinctions, or who can analyze things into their component factors. That was how the teaching was known in India at that time. So yeah, this is just one way to reflect on how we got to what we have today, how we got here, and there's still many fascinating things to discover probably about this process, and then how we engage in it, with appropriate kind of respect for those who have gone before us, the generations of monastics who have learned these teachings, chanted them, memorized them, passed them on, and then those who have written them down in different kinds of scripts, copied them until we have the luxury today to have an app on our phone where we find all the suttas in a few seconds. You can look everything up. So that's quite a technological progress. If we can make use of it, sometimes it can be quite useful. And then, of course, what remains is to put them into practice. We have the right conditions, especially here, like in this monastery, very conducive. All the conditions here, the four requisites, the forest, places to sit and walk, meditate, and it's possible to come and listen to the Dhamma, and practice the Dhamma Vinaya. So yes, it's quite delightful to be back. So I'll leave this with you.